So, hello and welcome. Welcome to the Coronet Theatre. I'm here with Gavin Turk on the occasion of the Kensington and Chelsea Art Week Festival. Gavin and I are going to talk about his life and work, specifically the Spirit of Painting, which is situated on the cupola of the Coronet Theatre. But before we get into the life part, I want to talk about death, but more specifically, a fate worse than death. So to go back to a time not that long ago, when you participated in...
Seems like a long time.
when you participated in Joshua Compston's Fate Worse Than Death. And I think what's interesting, this is an amazing book, if you haven't seen it already, it gives you some sort of context of this period. Gavin, you feature quite a lot in this book. There are lots of portraits of you, like this one, but also there's an amazing image of the Bash-Arat pitch.
It all revolves around
So,
a Bash-Arat
exactly, it all revolves around rats.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the Fate Worse Than Death, 1995.
Maybe even earlier, slightly earlier.
1992.
92, perhaps?
Yeah. Let's get
Quite
the dates
early.
right. 1992, we took over the...
And here's your rat.
We took over Charlotte Road Street,
Yeah.
and there was, I think there was probably like about 40 artists who were working in and around that area in Shoreditch in London, and quite a lot of them now household names.
Yeah.
It was rather a dreary, strange morning in, I think, late August.
Yeah, it was summertime.
And I think the idea really was to get artists making things, they're making their art, but communicating directly with an audience. And so it was kind of like art performances. But
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I really thought it was like a, how could it be really like a classic, almost like boot fair or like a school fete or something like that. So I kind of really took it quite literally, and I thought one of the things that you might have at a school fete was this Bash-Arat, and so I ended up with a drain pipe, baseball bat, and this
and the rat.
and this guy,
Yeah.
the rat, it's come back.
Which
The rat comes home.
Which I've held on to for all of these years,
It's
which
still
is
holding
amazing. Yeah. And I think that period is quite, I mean, especially that event, Fate Worse Than Death, I think it's quite interesting when you think about who was there at that time, and as you say, some of whom have become household names, and some of whom are no longer with us.
Yeah, well, obviously the whole thing was masterminded by Joshua.
Yeah.
And he obviously I think he passed away in 1995.
Soon after that.
Yeah.
So
in most mysterious circumstances as well. Seemingly,
Right.
he died from ingesting ether,
Right.
which he had in some vial in his gallery. Very mysterious.
And also very sad. It was a tragic loss. So can you tell me something about, from that period, what was your sort of evolution? How did you kind of, not orchestrate your career, but how did you evolve your work and your life as an artist?
I mean, I think then as now, unfortunately the answer is then as now. I think, it's very much a process of experimentation and trying things out and kind of making mistakes. I was fortunate enough to be represented by a gallery early on, which became White Cube Gallery, and so I was able from quite an early point to have a kind of audience connection, so I could really try things out with an audience. And it's, I mean, I think that from early days I was always trying to question the sort of like the authority of art, or what makes some art more art than other art. You know, even sort of over and above the simple question of what is art, it's like if we would leave that question aside, within art there is something that's considered better and worse art. There's something that's considered more or less art. So there is a kind of system of value within this thing that we care to call art, and that takes its cues from lots of different things that come into it, whether that's a sort of hegemonic power, whether that's a power structure which is enforcing a certain way of thinking, a certain way of making art as better than another, or whether that's to do sort of to do with advertising or promotion. Some things are more seen than other things. Some things get out more than others. Some things are more audience than others. And in many ways, I'd say that the sort of most important bits of art are the most sort of audience bits of art in a way. I mean, it's quite difficult when you throw that into like the commercial artistic sphere, but essentially artworks are floating signifiers. They're sort of objects that just absorb information. They absorb importance from around them, and in a way, like if you take an example of like the Mona Lisa, for instance, it's probably one of the most misunderstood pictures of all time. We don't really even know how to look at it, but everyone can find their route into it.
Why do you think it's misunderstood?
Well, if you look at it psychoanalytically, one of the most important times and one of the biggest moments when the Mona Lisa became super important was when it got stolen, was when it was missing. And the gap that created and the missing Mona Lisa was then filled up with the kind of importance and value that the Mona Lisa has. So it's almost like it's not really about what's depicted, it's more about the kind of almost like what's not in the frame, what's not there, or what in a way what people choose to believe is there. Like I famously got hugely invested in a portrait of Che Guevara by Alberto Corda, which I thought was probably one of the most important images of the 20th century, and it almost like you can substitute the word revolution with that image, the image of Che Guevara, and also one of the other things that image has, which a lot of other images don't have, is that the more distressed and used the image is, the more authentic it becomes. So if you have it on a t-shirt and it's really kind of well washed and crinkled and crumpled, it actually has more authority. It's actually sort of grows in stature. So the more sort of deteriorated the image is, like the kind of the more value it seems to have.
So that's also related to time. So with time, you can also apply a value to something. If it stands the test of time, like the Mona Lisa, for example, in a way, it's like time is the great leveler. Time decides what has value, what doesn't have value.
I think we're in a really interesting moment at the moment because art history itself is being kind of re-evaluated. There's lots of artists now that are coming into the I hate to use the word canon, the sort of like the line of art history. There's lots of like new artists, especially female or ethnic artists that are basically being brought into the social space and being sort of reinserted back into history. So history itself is under a transformative phase. So it's not that time has a finite. Time isn't really creating a finite value on anything. Time is a kind of curious point where the object takes on a kind of fourth dimension. So it's something that takes that bit of the third dimension of the object in space and then puts it into I suppose in human terms, it puts it into a story. It creates that object or recreates that object as a story going on into the future. And then that story gets told, reframed, gets shifted and changed, like through people playing with that story. So we're back to the idea that, and when we talk about audience, it's like an active ability to engage again and again with a story, or with a way that an object can be understood, with a way that an object can be seen.
And how are you sort of aware of the way people engage with your work? How is it possible that you understand what that sort of engagement is?
I think it's really difficult as an artist if you think too much and too hard about the audience reception, perception of your work. You know, people ask, you know, who would be your ideal audience? And obviously my answer to that, you know, is kind of like, oh, my ideal audience is kind of someone a bit like me, probably slightly more intelligent, hopefully. But it's there is a point like where it's a bit like asking a musician if they can change their tunes or change their work according to what the fans like, or how the fans are perceiving it. And you know, so it is super important to know that an audience exists as an artist, that there is this kind of category of audience, and I think audience in some ways are the artists. You know, there is a sort of Venn diagram where you've got one circle and another circle, and they overlap. And where one circle is the artist, the other circle is the audience, and where they overlap, the artwork exists in that overlap between the two circles. But obviously, at one point within that diagram, the audience has simply become the artist, and the artist has actually become the audience. So that, you know, there's a point at which you might see your work in a museum, and you see it very much like the audience. In fact, when you walk around, people might not know it's you that's standing there, and they start talking about the artwork. And this is always quite interesting, because you become like a fly on the wall, like starting to realise how people are seeing your work. I mean, recently in Cambridge, I've just unveiled a wrapped sculpture. It's a bronze sculpture, which looks like a wrapped figure. And I'm standing there beside the sculpture, and someone's talking to someone else, and they say, "Oh, when do you think what's this going to be?" They say, and obviously at that point they believe that
it's yet to be unveiled.
It's going to be unveiled, and then someone else is asking me, "What's it going to be?" And obviously I have to go, "Oh, this is it," and they're kind of slightly horrified. And
why is it like? Why is it like that? Why is it wrapped?
Why is it wrapped?
Yeah.
I think it's wrapped probably to provoke the question: when is this going to happen? I mean, it. You know, in many ways, it's a sort of historical reference. You know, there's a point like where it references Christo and Jean-Claude, and you know, there's a point at which it referenced wrapped sculptures like Man Ray's famous the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, which is a wrapped kind of sewing machine or something, like an unknown thing. I mean, it what it does is it sort of it takes the known and puts it into an unknown framework. I mean, there's ropes on it which also make it look like a parcel which is about to travel somewhere else. So it's about a sort of never-ending sense of shifting, like something in transit, basically.
I like that, and I like your image of the two circles coming together like the Vesica Pisces, and that idea that the artist, you know, you create your work. You're in your studio, you have your ideas, you manifest those ideas into artworks, and then the spectator comes along. And that relationship then between, once you've made your piece, and that's it in the gallery or in the gallery space, whether it's outside or interior, then the spectator brings their sensibility, and maybe it's that relationship that creates the sense of this is a work of art, and it's that relationship between the spectator and the object, which stands in for what you said earlier about posing the question of like, when is this going to be unveiled? When is it going to be unwrapped? These questions you wouldn't really normally come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's really beautiful when the question is, what's it going to be?
Yeah.
Because what's it going to be is about being,
Yeah.
like something existing.
And
when it's like, what's it going to be? It's like it's pre-existing, which almost gets you back to that sort of origin, the sense of origin. And for me, like this point at which, like, where things come from and how things originate is again like infinitely interesting.
Yeah, and where are they going? And that what is it going to be could also be what is it?
What is it?
When when people saw, I don't know, the Cubists still lives for the first time, it's like, what are these things? That kind of ideas. But it's like it's forcing people to question their preconceived ideas about what art is.
Sure, and I think that art probably does exist within people's preconceptions. And so if you want to get involved in art, I think you have to get involved in people's preconceptions somehow. I mean, I enjoy the idea that art might prompt people to reevaluate their preconceptions, but it might, the artwork might be, it might reveal to the audience their preconceptions. Like, it might help them to see how they are preconceiving of things, and to know that the process of preconception is actually is a point like where they're stopping themselves from being able to see what it is in terms of what it is. I mean, it's a bit like the question of like being an artist. One of the problems about like being an artist or calling yourself an artist is it's certainly, if you want to be an artist that questions what being an artist is, like if you are an artist, how can you question what being an artist is? Because you are one. So there's a point at which, even in the process of being a maker of art, I want to try to, or I find myself trying to step outside of that and getting back to a point like where I wasn't an artist, or I didn't think about life, or didn't think about the things I was looking at in those terms. But again, you go back and back and back. And you go back to that lovely kind of period where you were just infantile amnesia to the point like where you just can't remember anything.
Which is actually not a bad place to be sometimes.
Remember that point, I think.
Yeah.
I think as human beings, as meaning-making machines, I think the main process of making meaning is to try and remember, like, what happened when you got born.
Yeah, it's quite a nice thing to think about. And what about, so when you were talking about value, because I want to get on to the spirit of painting, and I think this is actually a very nice way of getting to that part of the conversation, because, so for example, if you come out of Queensway Underground and you're walking up towards Notting Hill, suddenly when you're looking up, you see the spirit of painting there in the distance as you're approaching the Coronet Theatre. And there's something actually quite beautiful about seeing a figure like high up, like, in the sky.
Yeah.
Just talking about art, which we normally see in a gallery setting, on a wall.
Yeah.
But having a sculpture on the cupola of the Coronet Theatre in this way, depicting kind of like yourself as a painter, but in the style of Joshua Reynolds, is that right? So kind of talk, in the style of the sculpture of Joshua Reynolds outside the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
So I'd like to understand a bit about the technical considerations and the difficulties and challenges that you had to face creating that piece.
Yeah, I mean...
But also, can we just begin with this sort of concept? And I think you have some images to show that evolution as well, so perhaps...
I have a talk, some slides.
Well, I think it would be great to see some images.
If we could go through them.
Yeah.
And
they're going to be on this screen, is that right?
So, if I try and do this, this is an original. So this is an original illustration of the building back in 1850 when it was first sort of designed, when it was first put there. And
Yeah.
obviously you can see around it, you've got a lot of space. The building is really quite dominant. There's not many, all the other buildings around it are very low.
Absolutely.
And so on this corner, this sort of like domed, very prestigious sort of building, like with all its classical orders and things, with like little triangular sections and the way that the windows are set out, the proportionality of the building, obviously is keying into a whole kind of classical vocabulary.
Yeah.
And then when we look closer up, we see that right on the top of the dome is a figure. Now the figure seems to be waving a sort of cloth. I kind of, and when I first saw that illustration, I thought, oh, you know, like I think this is this sculpture from Antwerp, which is called the Brabo, and the Brabo is it comes from a Roman legend, or a legend whereby a Roman soldier he cuts off the hand of a giant who's been cutting off the hand of traders who don't pay him a tax that come into the port of Antwerp. And apparently Antwerp comes from Antwerpen, which means hand throwing. So I thought originally that the sculpture on the roof had something to do with hand throwing a giant's hand.
Right.
But then I was told that, and I thought to myself, well, it's nothing to do with Antwerp, is it? So,
Well,
I don't know whether Notting Hill Gate twinned with Notting Hill twinned with Antwerp, maybe the Napoleon of Notting Hill. But then apparently I was told it was Hermes.
Right.
And I kind of thought a coronet, that's a crown, and Hermes, that's a winged cat.
Messenger type person.
Messenger,
Yeah.
I mean, a flying creature, Hermes, Apollo, flying. He's got wings, so he could land on a roof. So he's kind of like, he's a bit like Spider-Man or something. So he could work. You know, that might be something, but it doesn't really quite look like the figure that I saw.
So one idea
first.
that you had was to create like Hermes or Mercury.
I was really trying to follow through this sort of classical, thinking about the kind of classical way that the rooftop is. I mean, one of the things we've really got to understand is that because you can only ever see the sculpture on the roof, it's already, you're already like 100 meters away. You have to be 100 meters away from the sculpture to see it.
Yeah, to see it within the context of the building.
Well, to see it full stop.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you have to be on the road, and if you're at the door of the theatre, like, you're too close, so you have to go away.
Yeah.
You have to go away to come back. So you have to be 100 meters or so away from it in order to see it.
Yeah, you need that distance.
So what we're looking at really is not a question of detail. We're looking at we're looking at an idea in the distance.
Yeah, or a feeling.
A feeling,
Yeah.
or a pose, like
an attitude.
Yeah, like an attitude. So I mean, I started looking at other sculptures that were like figures on roofs as well, and I came across Anthony Gormley's series of figures that were standing on roofs.
Yeah.
As these kind of strange, lonely, odd, kind of like slightly scary ideas.
Are they permanent figures, Gormley's figures? They're permanent.
It's a moving, very moving. It was a moving show. I think it was it was a sort of touring show. And
I see.
The one in the slide here is in Hong Kong.
Right.
So but there's been a series of them. I think there was some in New York. There's some in London. I think that they've travelled around as a series of sculptures of figures on roofs of high buildings.
But this one looks quite.
So it's sort of about the city
Yeah.
and about. But it also seems to get drawn into like people getting trapped in buildings and jumping from buildings.
Right.
So it's sort of about a story of figures jumping from buildings as well.
Yeah, it has an ominous feeling to it.
There is a sort of slightly scary feeling to it.
Yeah.
Also, obviously, classically, you've got Nelson's Column.
Yeah.
I mean, Nelson's Column, amazingly, is this figure that you never see, like
Close up.
You never see it close up. You
Mhm.
just see it. I mean, you do sometimes see it when they're cleaning it or something. You
Mhm.
see like close up of it. It's very caricatured.
Yeah.
It's very sort of stylized. But it was never made to be seen at close range. It was
Yeah.
always made to be seen right at the top of a column.
Yeah.
I mean, an interesting thing, like to put a column. Here's a classical column, and let's put a
Mhm.
figure on top of it.
Yeah.
What's that? What's
Well,
that
it's
saying or doing?
quite loaded with symbolism,
But it's
isn't
very
it?
loaded with symbolism.
Yeah.
You know, it's very full of kind of white male
Nuance
rhetoric.
sort of thing.
Soz. You know,
Yeah.
colonial rhetoric. It
Yeah.
is full of that, and so
quite
here we
shocking,
are
really.
with a commission for putting something on a building,
Mhm.
a figure on a building, and also high up. So I also then here's Nelson's column again in the Sun,
Mhm.
and now here's a portrait of or a photograph taken of Sir Joshua Reynolds,
Yeah.
as portrayed by Alfred Drury in like 1915. So between sort of,
Oh,
I
so
think
quite
it's like,
late.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so it's a sculpture of a painter. This
Mhm.
painter, Joshua Reynolds, obviously, like he creates a club with Samuel Johnson and various other sort of like intellectuals of the day,
Mhm.
and they meet at something called the Turk's Head,
All right,
which
that's
is
nice.
a little club, the Turk's Head.
Yeah.
And,
Where was the Turk's Head? Like in
It's somewhere in Piccadilly.
Right,
I
okay.
can't remember
Like a
exactly.
coffee-
I think
was
where
it like a
was.
coffee shop?
I think where it was.
Oh, it
It's
sounds like a
bar.
pub.
It's
Yeah.
It's a bar.
Mm.
Yeah. And then they discuss like the idea of setting up an artists society,
Mhm.
an academy for art,
Mhm.
and obviously it is teaching
Mm.
and also like a place for artists to be.
Mhm.
So, and then it gets a royal charter. So
Yeah.
it gets royally affiliated, and it becomes kind of like the first, and probably becomes the kind of the game plan for artists, kind of clubs. You know,
Mhm.
artists getting together and creating their own kind of worlds, if you like.
Mhm.
And it seemed interesting here. You've got you know, that you've got this picture of a classical
Mhm.
classical sculpture of Sir Joshua Reynolds, a painter, and I found myself kind of trying to put this sculpture on the roof and seeing what it did, seeing how it worked,
Mhm.
seeing whether this gesture of painting the sky or kind of this slightly and then looking at the pose of it as well, because again, if we go back to the pose of it, it's like contrapposto, so it's actually a Roman pose that comes out of, it's the first point at which they stop kind of flattening the body,
Mhm.
and so they start using this pose where you've got a twist, you've got a leg
A
that's
movement.
straight, and then you've got a movement.
Mhm.
And they actually refer to this movement having a psychological disposition.
Mhm.
So
What does
like
that
the
mean?
idea, well, basically what it means is that like rather than just simply flat, like if you have it moving,
Mhm.
it seems to talk about the fact that the figure that's being portrayed
Mhm.
is involved in some psychological relationship to the audience,
Mhm.
or to the world
Yeah.
as they move. That
Mhm.
they have that it gives you but it comes almost back to your cubist thing.
Mhm.
It's about a kind of like
It was
3D,
a relation-
2D
yeah, it's a relationship.
Obviously,
So-
the
so-
right hand of the
Mhm.
figure
Mhm.
is kind of pointing with this stick, and the
Mhm.
other hand is like passive and holding the palette and brushes.
Yeah.
And again, like the pose itself, and in a way the abstraction of it,
Mhm.
brings me right back to like work that I made in 1993,
Mhm.
where I made a sculpture of myself as Sid Vicious.
Well, that's why I was keen to start this with the rat and that period, because that's what I think is really interesting. Is how
right.
the work that you did in the early 90s somehow is sort of resonating with the work that you're doing now. You know, and when we think about rats, for example, Bash the Rat. You think about rats residing kind of underground, sort of in the drains and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But of course, you're creating something that is actually in the air, it's like in space.
Yeah.
And it's sort of this opposite. So you're going from something, for example, kind of earthbound, and you're elevating this idea of the spirit of the painting
Yeah.
to the top of a building
It's
in relation
ironically
to the
not
sky.
I mean, there is a sort of irony in this, the spirit of painting, because I'm not really somehow like a
Well, it'd be nice to understand
painter.
more about.
I'm more of a maker.
Well,
So
Picasso.
I make paintings rather than
Yeah.
paint paintings somehow.
Well, Picasso always described himself as a painter, although he did everything, obviously.
Right.
So it's just like a way to, I think it's like a shorthand to describe the activity of creating
Okay.
using tools.
All
I don't know. I mean,
We'll
I'm just
go with that.
speculating.
Yeah. I mean, this was.
Mm.
I've put this slide in here. It's like 1995. I made a little model,
Mhm.
a little bronze model of me, like kind of
Mhm.
mini Oscar,
Mhm.
and this was called The Spirit of Gavin Turk.
I see.
And the idea with The Spirit of Gavin Turk was
Is that
was
life size?
No, it's exactly
Oh, so like
it's
a-
actually like
Oh, like an Oscar.
it's 30 centimeters or
Mhm.
something. And the idea with this was that every year it was to be awarded to another artist who I was inspired by. And
I love that
the
idea.
first year I actually like, and weirdly enough, Damien Hirst was with me at the time and it was in Berlin when we
Mhm.
first launched it. And I awarded the Spirit of Gavin Turk prize to, at that time, Michael Craig Martin, ironically,
Right, mhm.
because and actually later on, Damien Hirst, a few years later on, Damien Hirst did actually win the Spirit of Gavin Turk as well.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it all, what comes around goes round.
Yeah, sure.
But anyway, so
Oh, so
back
it's
onto
something
the
that's
Spirit.
passed on.
Well, yeah, the idea
It's
was
like a
that,
baton.
the idea was that actually, strictly speaking, the back of the award has
Mhm.
a little brass plaque on it, and
Mhm.
it just has years and then the
Recipients.
names
Yeah.
of artists on it.
Yeah.
I mean, and I send a jolly little note to the artist saying that they've been awarded the Spirit of Gavin Turk,
Mm.
and they just get a picture of it, or they just get that letter.
Oh, I
to
see.
keep.
Okay.
Yeah,
They don't keep it. They don't keep it for a
They
year.
don't even keep it. No,
No,
I get to
okay.
keep it all the time, and basically every year it builds up with a list
Yeah.
of people, a list of artists'
Nice.
names.
So
on
that's an ongoing initiative.
it was an ongoing initiative, but I haven't really kept it up. But yeah,
Okay.
it could be,
It could be revived.
It could be revived. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's still time for the Spirit of Gavin Turk.
Absolutely. But let's go back to the spirit of painting.
So if we go back to the Spirit of painting, there's obviously like the process of actually making this thing, which
Mhm.
is kind of weird because obviously the Spirit of painting requires a lot of clay, a lot of something not really painting,
Ironically, yeah.
a lot of sculpting,
Mhm.
and this was quite a mission in itself,
Mhm.
like in and of itself, to try and make a 1.5 times life size like sculpture. which
Yeah.
had
So
to-
how did you set about
at
doing
some
that?
point. Well, what I did was I immediately put it onto some wheels, which meant that it was even higher
Mhm.
than it need be. I think that was a tough one, and maybe I probably needed a kind of a balcony
Mhm.
or something
Oh, yeah,
around
like a
it.
frame, like
But,
a
but
scaffold.
obviously it's very difficult because you really have to be able to be able to walk around this whole thing and
Yeah.
go up and down. So there's a lot of
Mm.
going up and down ladders and going around.
So it has an armature inside,
It has an
presumably.
armature
Yeah.
inside.
Is that
you,
made
can see
of?
you can see on this one that like the metal structure that comes in from the back.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
And obviously I'm making this at the same time as making other pieces in the studio. So
Mhm.
there's a kind of strange, and you're talking about time earlier on. There was a sort of strange time of having this sculpture going on in the studio.
When
and
was it
making other
commissioned
things.
exactly?
When
When did you start thinking about it?
2017.
Ah, I see. So 5
Yeah.
years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
And in terms of deciding on that image, the image of the painter,
Yeah,
Gavin Turk as the
yeah.
painter.
Well, and
in-
then I chose Joshua Reynolds partly because of his pose,
Mhm.
partly because he's high art, partly because he had something to do with the Royal Academy,
Mhm.
and partly because there was this sort of sense of painting the attitude of it.
Mhm.
So he's got a wig and a sort of like long coat and
Mhm.
breeches and he has these kind of cool socks and tights.
Yeah, with buckled
And
shoes and
buckled
stuff.
shoes.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, what have I got? You know, and
Mhm.
I was like, oh, I've got like a long overalls and
Mhm.
and a beret.
Yeah.
And so suddenly, when you put those together, you end up
Mm.
with this kind of curious picture of someone with almost like a workman. You know,
Mhm.
you end up like with, rather than this kind of royal patron, you end up with someone who's a a worker,
Yeah.
someone who represents the workforce.
And also the beret is very much associated with Shay.
And the beret obviously like brings us back to Shay to a point.
Yeah, so it has those. You say that image of Shay is also could be replaced with the word revolution.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it is an image that I've worked with over time.
Hmm.
So then this is me in the sculpture, in the studio still.
So this is obviously the final, the image or the sculpture as the final piece.
As we can have it in the studio.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. So then it had to be
so-
finished in situ.
Well, it had to be sort of mounted. So
Hmm.
so we end up like, this is it, kind of on the crane,
Yeah.
like finding its way up the front of the side of the building,
Yeah.
up onto the roof.
Hmm. Where were you at this? Did you take that photograph?
I'm actually on the roof. I'm
You're on the roof.
I'm not. I'm on the road at this point.
Yeah,
And then I
okay.
run in and run upstairs. It's
Yeah.
a lot of running up and downstairs.
Okay. I can imagine.
Could've got on the
Well,
train.
left a bit, right a bit. So, in terms of the cupola, did the actual cupola itself had to be reinforced, or what was that
Well,
process like?
Yes, I mean structurally it was quite complicated to actually evaluate
Mhm.
like the strength of the cupola.
Yeah.
But as it happened, there was some little structural considerations.
Yeah, and do you
But
work out
basically
all of
on the
those?
whole, it's not me.
No, you work with like a structural engineer, or
Sure.
yeah.
And yeah, so there was some little structural, but in actual fact, the roof, because of its shape,
Yeah.
is actually very
Quite strong,
Is actually
yeah.
really strong. It's like one of the it's one of the strongest
Shapes that you can have.
When,
Mm.
In fact, when you put something on it,
It actually makes it even stronger.
It actually makes it even stronger.
Yeah.
So
And how
it
much
actually-
does the sculpture weigh?
Well, this is the thing.
Mhm.
The reality is
Mm.
that the sculpture's actually made of aluminium.
Oh.
Because I couldn't get all the maths
Mhm.
early enough. So the sculpture's actually made of aluminium,
Mhm.
and so it's not super.
It's not right. So do you have like a sort of a sculpted version in your studio, and then the aluminium versions on the cupola up this way?
I got no. Well, the only cast I've done is
Mm.
actually on the roof.
I see. Okay.
But I have the mould.
Yeah.
Because obviously the way you would make it is you have to then transform the clay. You have to
Mhm.
take a mould off the clay.
Yeah.
And so I've got a mould of it.
Mhm.
And but in many ways it's so site specific. This
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure how or where I would
Mm.
find another opportunity to
Mm.
display it. So it's, I mean, in some ways, this is the thing. I think it fits into this kind of curious metaphysical landscape that I'm creating with my works,
Mhm.
where I've got this large nail which
Mhm.
is in St Paul's, near just sort of behind the cathedral at One New Change, and then
Mhm.
I've got this giant door
Yeah.
which stands in a doorway.
Yeah.
So it's a 3.5 metre door in the door frame, which is
Mhm.
just outside the brand new Museum of Migration in Rotterdam Harbour,
Mhm.
as a permanent sculpture there.
Mhm. Do you have a photograph of that
and then
to
I've
show
got-
the viewers?
I'm sorry, I don't.
No. Okay.
This is the last slide I've got. But yeah, and then I've got the Ariadne wrapped sculpture in
Mhm.
Cambridge.
Mhm.
And and then I've got a giant sized plug in Paddington Basin as well.
Mhm. So is this
And-
like a new way of thinking? Is this like a new way of thinking about? Because obviously, you're not straight out of art school. You're established. Your work is sort of evolving. Although it's a lot of the themes, you're sort of evolving the themes, but also the work, the way you're thinking about the work is clearly evolving. So can you talk just a little bit? We have a bit of time about what's the thing you mentioned, the metaphysical dimension
Mhm.
to your work.
Mhm.
Can you talk a bit about your thinking now?
Well, the metaphysical thing again, like, comes back to. I mean, it's sort of like old-fashioned way of talking about thinking about being,
Mhm.
and in lots of ways, like these either like oversized things or things that refer to kind of lost time or things that refer to things that
Transience.
they're almost like they sort of, these things are frames through which we come to understand like what culture is or what we are.
Mhm.
You know, I'm always struck by and interested in the idea of how much of me is me and how much of me is sort of culturally defined.
Mhm.
How much of me is sort of given to me, and how much of me do I actually innately have?
Have you arrived at an answer to that
No,
question?
you never do. You
Right.
can't really do that, but
Mhm.
you do. But basically, what happens is you go through a sort of a buffeted experience of life and
Is that something?
questioning.
Is that something to do with nature and nurture?
Nature and nurture is another way of putting it.
Yeah. Mhm. It's the constant sort of battle.
I mean, and there's a massive battle at the moment with human beings and nature.
Mhm.
If we exclude ourselves, I mean, human beings are nature.
Mhm.
But
Well,
at
we
the
like to
same
think we are.
time, well, I think that people don't. I think people don't think. I think people generally don't think of themselves as nature.
Yeah.
I think people think of themselves as separate from nature, and I
Mhm.
think this is a big problem. I think there's generally like a lack of there's a human lack of respect for resource, for
Mhm.
natural resource, and this is becoming a bit of an issue.
Mhm.
Certainly on a climate level.
Mm. Does your work sort of speak in different ways to this problem of climate change?
Well,
Big problem.
Again, it's only really relatively recently that I've realised that the whole climate situation needs to and has to like really go deep into our cultural being, and so you know, I think as artists they have a responsibility in some way
Absolutely.
to kind of, I mean, you know, art does two things, doesn't it? I mean, one is it just simply holds up a wonky mirror to society
Mhm.
on one side, and on the other side it expresses the philosophy of the artist.
Mhm.
And so I think on the second bit, the philosophy of the artist, I mean, certainly for me, I feel there's a sense of responsibility
Mhm.
to trying to sort of share the good news, if you like, which
Mhm.
is that we're actually still here.
Mhm.
Human beings are still alive. Oh, there's a, you know, and all the time there's a possibility
Yeah.
that that they might be able to kind of like come clean or come clear on what they're up to.
Well, I'm very much of the. I mean, I think that, you know, where there's human life, there's hope. But I also think that through art, the artists can talk about things that are perhaps quite difficult things or abstract ideas, and express these difficult things or abstract ideas through art to people. So there's also a way that art can function in a way that could help people
Yeah.
to understand things in a way that is more human and less kind of corporate.
Yeah, I mean, you know, artworks always talk. They talk a sort of a plethora of stories at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they do. They say a lot of things at the same time.
Mhm.
Like I can sit here like chatting about my art or whatever, but like it's really not as good as the art itself. It's not.
Mhm.
I'm not doing as good a job as the art does.
Mm-hmm.
The object does an amazing job to kind of occupy lots of different places at the same time simultaneously, and you know, and hopefully you know, I make that in the work. I make
Mhm.
those conversations. I make that storytelling. I make that philosophy
Mhm.
and that wonky mirror in the work. That it's there, and so although, you know, I sit here to kind of promote and advertise the work,
Mhm.
essentially the work has to do the work.
Well, I think what's interesting about something like this is that you're not really describing the work. You're not sort of. I don't even think you're advertising the work. It's more about opening up a discussion that allows the viewers to think about how they feel about not just your work, but about art more broadly.
I hope so. I mean, you know, that would be good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we want to put a moral slant on it.
Mhm.
You know, I hope that there is essentially like the positivity that makes me create things,
Mhm.
like that makes me want to get off my chair and go and, you know, and go and make stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of stimulus, which
Mhm.
I think is a positive and vital thing.
Mhm.
You know, hopefully that is shared in the work.
Mhm.
I mean, I do it's not always the case, but I definitely really love to go and see art exhibitions that make me want to go and make some art. You know, the case for inspiration is really important, and I hope that you know that the art can sort of live up to that.
So I imagine when you were invited to create a piece for the cupola here at the Coronet, that invitation, because it's quite an unusual thing to be asked to do, I think.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite inspiring, I would have thought.
It's really hard, to be honest. It was really difficult to. To sort of to kind of figure out a way of making a work which was to be seen at 100, 100 meters. It's a really, it's quite a profound, it's a profound opportunity actually, and it did take quite a bit of time to kind of formulate or come through in a way, like to dream up the concept. And how to do it. I mean, incidentally, the notion of the self-portraiture as well, which I hadn't really gone into, the business of self-portraiture.
Yeah, talk a bit about that.
Generally speaking, for me, with self-portraiture, I pretty much like make sculptures of me as other people. Yeah. Or, in a way, what my sculptures are like a series of not other people. And so they sort of they become slightly characterised by the idea of being a self-portrait, and the artists, in a way, like the sort of modern artist, in effect, like from Velasquez onwards, like puts themselves into the frame. And so whether you kind of acknowledge or not, most art that fits into the category of modern or postmodern or modern since the beginning of modernism, like is characterised by the fact that the audience is asked to have a relationship with the artist, that there is this philosophy, and that so what it means is that nearly all art is kind of self-portraiture, whether you choose it to be or not to be, and that obviously means that when I do it overtly, I'm also like just bringing up that kind of sense that in some ways I'm indebted to the idea that it's all a self-portrait. So I feel that there's a question of the self. If you want to question like how art comes about, you need to get to come to terms with this idea of art as self-portraiture. I garbled that.
So we have some questions from our audience, and thanks very much for watching. And thanks, Gavin, you've been brilliant. I think there are probably too many questions to cover, but there's one, do art and activism go hand in hand?
Activism. Well, activism, I mean, in historic art terms, there's a whole like historic moment where you have actionism, and also you have a lot of the situationists who would get up and go and detour posters in towns, and I suppose like graffiti art or whatever is a kind of taking like the streets as a kind of canvas and going out and doing something yourself, what you fancy doing, taking part in that activity. The idea of activism now is obviously seems to be tied up with a certain kind of way of being, a certain kind of way of behaving, and I'm not sure that's necessarily all art. I mean, if I think of classically at the moment, you have Extinction Rebellion, which I actually think is incredibly good in aesthetic terms. I think aesthetically, the art department, Extinction Rebellion, is very powerful. What I mean when I say that, I mean that it gives a lasting impression. If you go on a demonstration with Extinction Rebellion, you get all these different characters and different ways that this demonstration will happen, and it will be aesthetic. It will have a visual dimension to it, and I think that really carries a message home.
Yeah.
It really gets much deeper into things, and it's also something of a celebration of the topic, of the subject, of being on a demonstration. Like when the demonstration's there and everyone's like, making an effort, looking good, writing great slogans, signs, working hard together. You really do feel like you are part of changing history.
Yeah. And it's a bit like theatre, where you tell, through the act of theatre, you tell the story of what the purpose is. So another question is your creative process any different when you're creating work for a public outdoor space?
So the creative process is no different, or I don't really know exactly what the creative process is, but I think that the creative process probably is the same, whether you're creating a public artwork or just something for a friend. And yet obviously you do have to deal with certain sort of structural or certain conditions that are going to exist around the public artwork. So there's always the notion of trip hazards, or there's various structural problems that you might have. You've got things to do with longevity issues which you might not have for something that's always going to be inside. Whether these encroach on the creative process, they probably do, but so I've now unanswered what I said to start with by saying that now yes, the creative process is changed and transformed through the process of making, and so if you're making things for a certain environment, it will have
considerations that you have to take in.
Yeah.
I think what you're describing is very
answering and unanswering a question.
Well, I think you're describing just a very sort of complex.
I mean, it's a good question, and in effect, what it does, and like the other question as well, like it's about like how can we talk about the creative process? What is the creative process? Where does it come from? We come back to our origins.
Yeah, and what language can we employ to talk about these ideas? In the 21st century. Talking of time, there's the question here is: when you create a work, do you think of how it would live through time? Are you wanting to leave a legacy of the time you are living for the future generations?
I mean, I think you do. I think one does, and I think within, again, coming back to this idea of art, I think that what art does is when I say you hold up the wonky mirror, I think that that there is some point at which you are laying down a kind of a cultural artifact of that period, and that there is unless it's an ephemeral work, unless it is like a performance artwork, and even still with performance art, you can see that that gets heavily photographed, and then the photographs become
the thing,
like something that goes into a museum. I mean, certainly when you think about 70s artists whose work, actual physical work, no longer exists, but their photographs of their work are in all the museums and are part of the art history.
Yeah, or if you think of like The Rites of Spring, Nijinsky's thing with, which was just like, so kind of out there. People have been talking about it even to this day, since the 1920s.
Yeah, I mean, time is an important factor, and it can change things, because obviously if you make things that are time specific, i.e. they're about the politics of the day, then it may be that within like 10, 15 years even, like the various characters portrayed, like no one actually knows who they are. They're non-existent. They've disappeared from history, and in a way, like the sort of central tenet of your art has kind of disappeared. That may not necessarily be the end of your art. The art may still be able to survive,
but in a different context.
But it would be filled up with something different. Yeah.
So I think we have time for maybe two more.
I mean, we are in a. I think also, like, I mean, I don't want to jump the questions here, but they're obviously, we are, and again coming back to history and looking at sculptures in this way, we are in a period where Colston sculpture in Bristol gets pulled down and thrown in the water, and the people, and they put the sculpture on its side in the museum, and the people like responsible for doing it got let off. And basically what we realised is that culturally it felt okay. It culturally felt, I mean, there had been, to be quite honest, there had been many years of pressure to take the sculpture down.
Right.
It wasn't a new thing. It just was given a lot of
that momentum was
momentum
there.
and impetus by a sort of anti-colonial kind of pressure that really is in the air. And but it is interesting how, like, the in a way the representation of power, what a sculpture might be, like what a public sculpture might be, like how a public sculpture represents power, or power of the day, or power of to continue through time. We'll just leave it on the interesting.
Well, I think there's the area that you're talking about. This question could be quite interesting for you to think about. We're living in quite turbulent times worldwide. As an artist, what kind of actions do you consider important for raising consciousness regarding the political climate taking place today?
Okay, so that does fill in.
So you have 2 minutes.
But we don't. Do we close off after 2 minutes, or is it?
I don't know.
We can
I see.
We can run.
Okay,
we can
great.
run on a little bit. So
Right.
It's okay.
Okay.
So I
wasn't.
Don't stress me.
So I didn't mean to stress
Can
you.
you say
No
the question
stress.
again? Because it actually is quite. It's actually a really good question.
We're living in quite turbulent times worldwide. As an artist, what kind of actions do you consider important for raising consciousness regarding the political climate taking place today?
Okay. I mean, again, it sort of draws on the idea of activism, I think, or I think the bottom line of that, because it asks about the actions of an artist, like what are the actions of an artist? How should an artist act, or how should a sculpture act? What is the act that the sculpture is performing? And then there's a problem with the word acting, because if you're acting, you're maybe not doing, maybe you're acting.
Yeah, it's like almost like a
It's
pretense.
a play.
Yeah.
But I think that for me, I feel it's important to sort of hold a. It's just such a difficult answer, really, because it requires me to talk about holding some sort of moral or some sort of like line of believing in some sort of truth, and like trying to be sort of like and like this, trying to be honest in effect with what you know about and how you might represent what you know about. But at the same time, for me, a lot of my work is about like representing fakes or using fakes, or using the question of something that's obviously not original to question people's conception of originality, that people believe originality or the truth or that something that's real exists in a certain form, but it only exists in that form if you exist like wholeheartedly within that ideology or within that paradigm, within that block. So as much as anything, like the artwork or my artistic practice might be about trying to break myself out of and bring an audience with me out of that paradigm, out of that ideological place where people are seeing the world and believing the world to exist in a certain kind of way, and because they're believing and seeing the world existing in a certain kind of way, they're probably reenacting bad things and having bad thinking in certain places. and so what there is the attempt, and I think that this is the sort of like, I think this is the idea of a valid attempt
Mhm.
for artists to try and expose the audience to new paradigms, to new possibilities.
Mhm. Yeah, to different ways of thinking. What is the password for the iPad? Thank you. So I'm sure this is a question that a lot of the audience would like you to answer. Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Well, I'm actually working on an exhibition for a gallery in Cambridge
Mhm.
called the He-On Gallery, and it's called In Search of Ariadne, and the exhibition goes some way, or I'm trying in some way to make an exhibition that explores the public sculpture that I have in the square, in the Station Square in Cambridge.
I see.
So there's a point like where we're trying to tie together, maybe like through a golden or a red thread,
Mhm.
the way that certain artworks get made to as kind of answers to other artworks. It's almost like the process of making art. Quite often you unpack a load of things and you make something, and it solves problems,
Mhm.
but at the same way as it solves problems, it kind of creates a load of other ones.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when they try and like create matter, they also create antimatter at
Mhm.
the same time.
Mhm.
Bit annoying.
There's always this. It's like a dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah, and so I guess it's, you know, as much as anything, like the program going forward is to try to tie up the loose ends.
Mhm.
But as you tie up the loose ends, you make lots of other ends.
Mhm.
In my ends.
And with the thread, which may be gold or red, will it be actual thread, or is that sort of like a metaphorical?
I think that was a metaphorical.
Okay,
Yeah. I think that was a mental thread.
that's nice. Well, because it was so specific, the colour was so specific, or the material.
Well, it was
I
always
thought-
golden to me, but
Yeah.
but suddenly I came across a book, the golden, the red thread,
I see. Okay,
and
the red thread sounds
this is
more
Charlotte
revolutionary,
Higgins written a book, The Red Thread,
right?
and which is absolutely incredible, and it culturally and historically looks at this character of Ariadne.
I see.
And the whole kind of idea of, in a way, like the creation of Crete
Mhm.
and Knossos and the labyrinth,
Mhm.
and the idea of that really in terms of an archaeological and an art historical kind of almost like myth make.
Yeah.
That, I mean, we don't seriously even believe that someone was born half a bull and half a human.
Yeah.
That's too much.
Mm.
But
Some people are bullish. But also there's the umbilical cord, which is also like a thread.
Ah.
But that's something else. Another question we have here is, are you painting clouds in the sky?
I did do some. I have a whole range of clouds paintings at the studio,
Yeah.
which I made many moons ago.
Yeah.
And I think I was fascinated by the abstraction of them and the idea that you might be able to read into them. So
Mhm.
I've got a series of cloud paintings that I've
Mhm.
done. I also am very interested in smoke.
Mhm.
And the way that smoke starts to kind of create forms and shapes and make like still photographs of smoke portray like where the air is and how it's a sort of a portrait of something invisible.
Yeah.
Like the formation of a cloud, one of the most wonderful things about it is it's actually as much the formation of the air around the cloud as
Yeah,
the
which is
cloud
really
itself.
beautiful. Yeah. But I wonder whether this question, are you painting clouds in the sky, whether that's more specifically
up the top.
yeah, on the cupola.
Yeah.
So are you kind of thing.
Yeah.
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 And that's exactly what you're doing, painting clouds in the sky. We have many in London.
or
Or not, as the case
or
may
not,
be.
Yeah.
Or just painting the sky.
Yeah, or painting an idea somewhere else.
Hmm.
So I'm not really there. I'm there as a metaphor for a figure painting,
Hmm.
being in the process of painting.
Mm.
I mean, you know, again, like, because we're so far away, it could be a magic wand. You know,
Hmm.
it could be Harry Potter.
Mm.
It could be Hogwarts.
Do we have time for maybe one more question? Okay, last one. I think this is a nice way to end because it speaks to carrying on the baton. So what is your criteria for awarding the Spirit of Gavin Turk Award to an artist?
Well, that was what I was saying. I think that the criteria was that it was the artist that had inspired me the most.
Right.
So in a way, like the artist that I'd been, whose work I'd been kind of most sort of charged up by,
Hmm.
whose work I'd been looking at that year.
Mm.
I mean, they didn't necessarily even need to be
Living.
living artists.
Mhm.
No,
Mm.
they could be previous.
Yeah, or dead artists.
Previous.
Great. Well, Gavin, I want to thank you. I also want to thank the audience. Thank you very much for joining us.
Cool.
I want to thank the Coronet Theatre for hosting this conversation, and also the Kensington and Chelsea Art Week Festival for being a part of this. And the festival will go on for a week, starting today, I believe. So yeah, enjoy the festival, enjoy the summer, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.